Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session for 30 minutes. Tim Baker's my name. Welcome wherever you are. I realise it may not be morning where you are, but it is here in Brisbane. So welcome. I'm going to share my screen shortly. And look, because it's so quick, 30 minutes, if you do have comments or questions, go to the chat box and type them in. If I can't deal with them during the presentation, obviously I'll deal with them after. So I just want to make that clear. So let me now share my screen and we'll launch into the process. Okay, so I want to talk about some interesting research. Now, it's not new research, but I think it's very interesting research that's come out of MIT. And I think it's really quite interesting because it's got enormous implications for teams. And the research was basically on high performing teams and, what separated high performing teams from, from mediocre teams. So let's launch into it and see what we've got. So those who I haven't introduced myself to, as I said, Tim Baker's my name. I'm an author. I'm just completed my 11th book now, and I thoroughly enjoy what I do. Obviously, my books are around leadership and development. I get to present at lots of conferences and give keynote addresses. I also do executive coaching, and in my spare time, which obviously I don't have too much with all that going on, I play rugby still in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. And so that's just a bit of fun. I wouldn't say I was any great athlete in that sense. So just a lot of fun. Okay, so now obviously I guess I'm promoting one of my books, which is Winning Teams, and I just wanted to point out that a number of key people in the sporting world and in the corporate world have written some nice testimonials about the book. And certainly you can get a copy of the book, and I've got a special offer for you at the end of the presentation if you'd like to take advantage of that. And one of the best testimonials came from Nick Farr-Jones, who was the former Wallaby captain and World Cup captain for Australia, and he said some nice things about my book. So even though it's been endorsed by people in the sporting world, the book is essentially a book for business. And in the book, really the key of the book, I guess you could say, is that we're looking at 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. Now, you can see there on the diagram on the right-hand side what those 8 characteristics are around the outside. I don't think they would surprise you. They certainly didn't surprise me, but through my own observations, 20 years working with teams, my own research in the area, and just my reading, I've come up with these 8 characteristics. Now, I don't doubt there are other characteristics, and many people have suggested such, but I think at the end of the day, the characteristics that I've identified that are critically important are building trust, sharing leadership, being agile, creating purpose, managing stakeholders, improving systems, utilizing diversity, and learning continuously. Now, if you think of any high-performing team that you've worked with, and if you're lucky enough to be working with one now, well done. But I would suspect that nearly all of those teams would have those 8 characteristics in place. And today I want to talk about a concept around shared leadership, because talking about relationships in teams, if you're trying to get people to share the leadership, then one of the things that you need to do, of course, is to get people engaged in the process. Now, a lot of that occurs if there's a high level of trust between team members. So all of these 8 characteristics are interrelated, and we just split them up for convenience so it's easy to talk about each one. But the bad news is if one's missing, say, for example, if building trust is missing, then it's likely that shared leadership will probably not be a characteristic of that team. But the good news is that if you work on one of those 8 characteristics, What will happen, of course, is that that will permeate into other characteristics. So the idea is you don't have to sort of sit down and say, I've got 8 things I've got to work on and we're all busy people. If you work on one of those 8 characteristics, it will have an impact on the other 8 characteristics. And that's what I suggest in the book, is to focus on one area and work on it and develop it. And once you've done that, it will obviously impact positively other characteristics around the model. Okay, so let's launch into perhaps one of the objections that people might have when they're thinking about this topic about relationships in teams. A team leader has limited control over working relationships. Now, yes and no. Obviously, you can't completely, control relationships in teams. But I think my experience, at least, is that team leaders often underestimate their ability to create an environment where working relationships flourish. And I think sometimes we think that we won't put too much effort in because it's really not worth it. So I'm hoping I can give you some insight into that in our short session today and give you some clues as to what you could do in this regard. So we're going to look at a concept of task and relationship. And if you think about it, all teams are made up of tasks. Obviously, there's a product or a service that you're offering, and that's the task dimension of teamwork. But there's also the relationship dimension of teamwork. And I find it interesting that this is the area that causes the greatest grief. And if you wanted to separate a high-performing team from a mediocre team, I would suggest to you it wouldn't be the task dimension, it would be the relationship dimension. It's true in the sporting world. I think it's true in the business world. And yet we spend, let's say, 90% of our time on the task dimension. So what I want to encourage you to do is to spend a bit more time on the relationship dimension. Traditionally, what happens is when someone becomes a team leader, what they often do is they might have a sort of a team building exercise at the beginning. And then, of course, that's a lot of fun. People get a lot out of it. They get to know each other a little bit better. And that's all good. And then it gets shelved. And then we get stuck into what we're there to do, which is the task dimension. So I think the relationship dimension is an ongoing concern, something you've got to work at constantly. Obviously, I'm going to share the research with you from Sandy Pentland from MIT, and I'm going to share what he came up with. Very interesting research. And out of that, there are 3 key elements that I'd like to talk about in terms of the relationship dimension. So, as I said earlier, you've got the task dimension and the relationship dimension of teams. And the other thing about the task and the relationship dimension is it depends on where you're at. For example, now we're in a sort of a, COVID crisis. Obviously tasks are always important, but relationships can be even more important in terms of turmoil. And so a good team leader will actually fluctuate between being very task focused and very relationship focused. And they'll try and do, depending on the circumstances. Obviously, if there are deadlines or a crisis or something, then concentrating on getting the task done is critically important because you're up against a deadline. But there are other circumstances where you need to fluctuate to the relationship dimension. And of course, I'm going to concentrate on that today. Now, this is why it's complicated. And I just share with you that, if we look at the relationship dimension for a moment, you can see up the top, obviously, we've got the task dimension. But if you think about the relationship dimension, we can split that up into 2 parts when it comes to a team. We've got the team relationships. And what I mean by that, of course, is each team member's relationship with each other. And then you've got your relationship with each team member. Now, we could probably add a third element there and talk about stakeholder relationships as well. So obviously it's quite complex, and these things ebb and flow depending on how people are feeling at any particular time. So the first and foremost thing I'd strongly recommend that you do is you work on your individual relationships with each team member. And by doing that, interesting enough, you will create an environment where team members can work more effectively together. And I'll share that in the research. So the task is obviously what you do. The individual relationships are catering for the needs and interests and motivations of the people in your team. And of course, you've got your team relationships, and that's all about harmony and balance and collaboration. So Pentland in his research talks very much about this team aspect of the relationship dimension. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So just to put this into context, there's a lot of models out there on the concern for people and the concern for production. So, it's not a new concept, obviously. And one of those models you can see in front of you, which is a typical 2x2 matrix, where you've got the country club leader who has a high concern for people and a low concern for production. So everyone enjoys coming to work, but not much gets done. You got the impoverished leader who has a low concern for people and a low concern for production. They're usually the people who really are reluctant leaders. They're put into that leadership role, but they're basically there in name only. And then you've got the task leader, and the task leader, of course, is high on production and low on people. And then you've got the team management, and it looks at first glance, the team management place would be the place to be. But in actual fact, the place to be is right in the middle, because then you can fluctuate between the four. And a team leader has to be very flexible to do that. And so let's have a look now at the research and share with you what Pentland came up with. Now, what Sandy Pentland did. Now, Sandy Pentland, I might say, is a technology guy. So it's interesting because he fitted up teams with a little lapel sort of device. And so this lapel device was there for, weeks on end. And what this little device did is it actually tracked the conversations that each team member had with each other. So it didn't actually track necessarily word for word what was said, but it did track who was talking to whom, and who was talking to whom about what as well. So there was a bit of that going on. And so after several weeks, of course, he crunched all the data and came up with some interesting insights that came out of that. So the first thing that it did do, and this won't surprise anyone, Pentland's research confirmed that communication plays a critical role in team success. Because what he found was he measured these teams against their performance. So in this sort of research, he had high-performing teams and low-performing teams and mediocre performing teams. So he was able to track communication patterns and correlate that with results. And so his main conclusion, was that communication plays a critical role in team success, which won't surprise any of us. So more importantly, if we drill down a bit further, it's the communication patterns more than the message. Now it gets interesting. So it's not so much, interesting enough, it's not so much what is said in the team meetings or amongst the team that makes the difference. It's more the patterns of interaction between team members. Now that's where it gets interesting. So obviously Pentland tracked a lot of corridor conversations, people in corridors talking to each other informally. All of those things were recorded on this device. He also found that it's the way teams communicate in the informal setting actually had a greater bearing than on the team meetings. Now, when you think about it, when you have a team meeting, whether you do that online or face-to-face, it's a little bit of a staged event, isn't it? I mean, everyone says their little piece when they need to, and the leader build, it's not quite as, it's not the same thing as having a conversation in the corridor. But what Pentland found was that it was the informal communication in the corridors which actually made more of a difference than what happened in the team meetings. Now, the team meetings were recorded as well, but ultimately it was what was happening in the corridors, he argued, that counted. So he suggested, and his conclusion was that the best predictors of productivity were the team's energy and engagement outside formal meetings. Now, I'll define what we mean by energy and engagement in a moment, but this is ultimately what he thought was the most important when he tracked these high-performing teams against the mediocre and low-performing teams. And according to his research, energy engagement accounted for about a third of the variation in dollar terms of team productivity. So the interesting thing here is that it's often the corridor conversations, whether they happen or don't happen, not so much what is said, but the fact that they happen or don't happen, which actually has a greater contributing factor to team productivity than what happens. So in other words, you could run wonderful team meetings, but if these informal communication patterns aren't occurring, then that's going to impact on the bottom line, according to Pentland. So let's look at that a little bit further. Now, of course, this is a bit of a chicken and the egg situation, because we could say, well, does a high performing team promote better communication between team members, or does better communication build high performance? So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? So if we've got good communication, does that lead to high performance? Or is it that high performance is actually a byproduct of good communication? I think it's probably a bit of both, but that's just my hunch. But it's an interesting question nevertheless. And then, of course, the other question is what encourages this good communication, particularly the informal communication that we've been referring to. So let's have a look. So I know this, and basically his research says that it seems almost absurd that how we communicate could be more important to success than what we communicate. So it's the patterns of communication. Now, think about this for a minute. Think about your team meetings. Does one or two people in your team dominate your conversations? Probably likely. Does it also mean that a couple of people are very quiet and hardly say a word? Now, what Pentland's saying is that in a high-performing team, that everyone feels that they have a role to play in a team and they feel comfortable contributing to that. So in other words, people aren't left out of these conversations that happen outside the team meeting. And so a high-performing team is a team where there's a pattern of communication where everybody's contributing and everybody is pitching in and communicating with each other. So there's not one or two dominant people in the team that basically run the show, outside you, of course, if you're the team leader. So that's a very interesting. So basically everyone feels that they have a place in the team. Not only do they feel they have a place, they're willing to contribute as a result of feeling as if they have that place in the team. So basically, he came up with 5 key factors, and you might want to think about your own team in this regard. So out of his research, he found that everyone in high-performing teams contributes equally in casual interactions. No one feels left out. No one's ostracized. 1 or 2 people don't monopolize conversations. That was the first interesting thing. Secondly, meaningful conversations occur in face-to-face encounters with vibrance and energy. So it's not just the perfunctory, hello, how you going? There's actually a little bit more energy and vibrance in these conversations that come up in high-performing teams. In other words, people are genuinely pleased to interact with each other. And not only that, they make a little bit more effort than just the dehydrated talk that can go on sometimes between team members. Thirdly, team members communicate with one another without the need of the team leader. So the team leader is still important. He's not saying that, but ultimately a lot of the team can make their decisions without having to defer to the team leader, which is a relief to know. So a high-performing team is a team that's highly capable of empowering themselves to make judgments and decisions without necessarily deferring to the team leader, which is obviously a good thing. Of course, the team leader still needs to be kept in the loop, but ultimately it's the team that makes a lot of these decisions on the run. They engage in more one-on-one conversations with each other than usual. So when Pentland looked at the patterns of these teams, what he found was that the high-performing teams had a much stronger network of conversations between each other. And so he was able to make these judgments because he could look at their results and compare it to the type of conversations that people had, or the frequency of conversations that people had. Team members are willing to network beyond the team and to bring back what they've learned to the team. So everyone in a high-performing team actually does feel it's their place to be responsible for stakeholder management. It's not just left to the team leader to do that. So high-performing team members actually go out of their way to have more conversations with their key stakeholders. Often in a low-performing team, and I'm sure you're aware of it, it's often that it's left to you or whoever the team leader is to make all those connections, which of course is not realistic, because at the end of the day, many of your team members have good working relationships with many people beyond the team, better working relationships than you have. So why wouldn't they pursue that? Now, Pentland summarized his research by saying that there are three key elements in high-performing teams, which pretty much summarizes all of this. He argues that energy is high, and what he defines as energy is the frequency and value of conversation between team members. So what that means in practical terms is there's far more engaged conversations outside the formal team meeting between team members. Secondly, engagement is the distribution of energy amongst team members. And as I said earlier, it means that people are having more frequent conversations in corridors or online or wherever it might be with each other outside the normal team meeting framework. And exploration means they're involving more communication patterns beyond the team. So high-performing teams have more conversations with their key stakeholders that they rely on in order to get their, to get their services or products accomplished. So energy, engagement, and exploration. Now you might say, well, I get that, but what can I do? Well, I think the core essence of being a good team leader is for you to develop these regular check-ins with your team members and do whatever you can to improve the quality of your working relationship, even if it's only by 10% with each team member. You are setting the tone that these relationships are critically important, and that and that sets the platform for people to start having more energy, engagement, and exploration ultimately. And that, remember, is the essence of what a high-performing team is. So folks, that is pretty much the essence of the research. I'll just stop sharing for one moment. So I wanted to just, so the key messages are: work hard on the relationship dimension of teamwork, because I think if you do that, you're actually adding enormous value to your team. And I think that, we've all seen it, we've all seen teams where people have got very high levels of technical expertise. That doesn't necessarily, of course, make them a high-performing team, does it? So the missing element, obviously, is the relationship dimension. So if you're wise and you want to build that high-performing team, then you're best served by working on your one-on-one relationships with each team member. That creates the platform for energy, engagement, and exploration, which I mentioned earlier. Okay, I'll just go back to my screen, if I may, and I just wanted to make two announcements before I finish up. Thank you. One of the many of you would be aware of this, but every Friday around this time, I try and make it 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. I try and make it consistent. I can't always do that, but every Friday I have a half an hour session on an interesting topic. And next week, I've got a topic on what is job crafting. So I'm going to talk about the job crafting now. It's been around for a while, but it's now getting a little resurgence because of COVID and a range of other matters that we're now needing to be a bit more flexible. So if you'd like to know more about job crafting, you are welcome to join me next Friday at 10 a.m. And I'll be sending you out a copy of the slides and the recording. So you'll get a copy of the link and you'll be able to just click on that link and that'll take you in as you did today. And you'll be able to get yourself sorted for what next Friday. So that's one thing I want to do, and just keep your eyes peeled because I have the session every Friday. You're welcome to join as many of those as you like. Now, the other thing is, quick plug, if I may, if you'd like a copy of my book, Winning Teams, I've got a little discount for you. Amazon price is $35, although it fluctuates a little bit. That's inclusive of postage. But if you purchase directly from me, I will send you a copy for $25 inclusive of postage. So all you've got to do is send me an email and by the close of business today. And if you do that, of course, I will organize your payment and send it out and sign it for you. And you'll get your book at a discount price. So you're more than welcome to do that. And I hope that I'll be able to catch up with you next week. And that's about it from me. So thank you, folks. Have a wonderful day. And I would say to you, stay positive, because I think one of the key things is to bring your best self to work every day, even though we're going through some challenging times at the moment. I think it's critical that a team leader do that. Thanks, Mark, for the feedback. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone. So I'm done. Have a great weekend and we'll catch up. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Karen. Appreciate it very, very much. Thank you. And cheers, everyone. All the best. Bye.